Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Good evening and welcome to this program, The Pig War, San Juan Islands in Conflict. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the Community Relations team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is Islands. Our presenter tonight is Dr. Stephen Dow Beckham. He's a professor of history emeritus at the Lewis and Clark College. He's taught college students for 42 years in courses on the history of the American West, Native Americans, and environmental history. Beckham is a former Oregon Professor of the Year, and he is presently chairman of the Oregon Committee on Historic Preservation and a member of the board of the Theodore Roosevelt Library Foundation. Dr. Beckham, thank you so much for sharing this unique part of the Pacific Northwest history with us.
Thank you. Good to be with you this evening. Oh, good. There I see the advancer. Our subject this evening is perhaps a footnote to American history, but interestingly, it was an event that transpired here in the Pacific Northwest, and eventually it helped resolve some of the pivotal issues that were legacies of the American Civil War. It's also in a location in the San Juan Islands that some of you may have visited in the past or may well want to visit in the future. A beautiful part of the Salish Sea or Puget Sound in the western part of the state of Washington. The Pig War was a big fuss in a really quiet place. And I think the quietness of the Salish Sea and the San Juan Islands is mirrored in this watercolor by James M. Alden in 1857 that shows a little harbor, a village, a few vessels on the water, and the monolithic Mount Baker rising near the Washington, British Columbia border. So we have a poetic expression, a poem that's going to help theme our presentation, and Laurel's going to be our poet reciting these stanzas.
Yes. Let me tell you a story of a San Juan pig. It wasn't worth much cause, it wasn't very big, but it rooted in a garden and nearly caused a fray between the King of England and the USA.
There were some defining moments in the 19th century that were a prelude to the Pig War. One of them happened in the year 1818 when the United States and Great Britain created an area in the Pacific Northwest where they agreed to joint occupancy. It's the area in green in the map, the Oregon country. Then the following year, the United States, in a political maneuver, entered into the Adams-on-East Treaty with Spain. That set the 42nd parallel as the northern boundary of California. Also by that agreement, Spain ceded to the United States any discovery rights based on the voyages of discovery, and there had been many of them north all the way to Alaska. So the United States picked up rights of discovery from Spain. 5 years later, the United States entered into a similar agreement with Russia, setting the 54th parallel, 5440, as the southern boundary of Alaska, or the very northern line on this small map. So the United States and Britain agreed to share joint interest in the area in green. Spain would stay in Mexico, Russia would stay in Alaska, and that set the stage for more events. Those events unfolded briskly in the 1840s, particularly when James K. Polk was campaigning for president. His themes were 5440 or fight, namely expanding the United States all the way to Alaska, all of Mexico or none, and of course, the familiar phrase manifest destiny, meaning that it was manifestly destined or the will of God that the United States would expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Further, his campaign in 1844 was to resolve the Oregon question, to settle the matter of joint occupancy and decide who would govern what on the West Coast. Well, there were some interesting ramifications underway in the 1840s. Clearly, the British had a very good claim through discovery rights and the operations of its fur companies to the area north of the Columbia River. But equally, the Americans argued that because of Oregon Trail immigration and other factors, they could claim the country to the south and east of the Columbia River. So this is the way things started to divide out in the mid-1840s. The United States had a whole list of claims to Oregon. An American from Boston, Captain Robert Gray, a fur trader, sailed into the Columbia River in 1792 and gave the name Columbia to the stream because of his ship, the Columbia Rita Viva. In 1805 and 6, the Lewis and Clark expedition, a U.S. Army contingent, established Fort Clatsop at the mouth of the river and mapped part of the interior of the Pacific Northwest. 5 years later, the Pacific Fur Company, owned in part by John Jacob Astor of New York City, established Astoria, a permanent Euro-American outpost in the Indian country of the Pacific Northwest. Even though Astor's partners sold out to the Northwest Company of Montreal, Canada in 1813, the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812, said everything goes back to the way it was before the war. All is restored to status antebellum. So the Americans said, well, even though we sold Fort Astoria, we still have a claim to the mouth of Columbia River. In 1819 and 1824, the United States gained discovery rights from Spain and Russia. William Slocum, a U.S. naval officer, visited Oregon in 1837 and wrote positively about the Columbia River. He was a special agent of the Andrew Jackson administration and recommended that the nation acquire both the Columbia River and San Francisco Bay. In 1841, 5 vessels of the U.S. exploring expedition of the U.S. Navy visited Oregon and sent overland parties upstream to Walla Walla and south to Sacramento to Sutter's Fort in the Central Valley of California. And by 1843, Oregon Trail immigration was underway, with over 900 immigrants arriving that year and nearly 3,000 in 1845. So these items, this list, buttressed U.S. claims to the Oregon country. The issue was resolved. The Oregon question was addressed in the Oregon Treaty of 1846. It established the 49th parallel as the boundary between the U.S. and Canada, and that persists to the present day. In fact, that boundary is presently closed for Americans entering Canada because of COVID. The Hudson's Bay Company agreed that it would withdraw from all of its forts and farms south of the 49th parallel and move its personnel and operations into British Columbia. The San Juan Islands were set aside to be divided between the United States and Great Britain via the principal channel, and that became a key issue. And finally, the treaty said there will be established a claims commission that will settle the value of the Hudson's Bay Company properties and award a monetary settlement to that private company for its investments that it is abandoning in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. Oops. The Hudson's Bay Company had significant investments in the Pacific Northwest. At Oakton, Oregon, in the Umpqua Valley was Fort Umpqua, the southernmost post in all of North America. Fort Nisqually on Puget Sound and Fort Walla Walla on the plateau, as well as Fort Okanagan up on the northern plateau were its posts in Washington. Fort Hall and Fort Boise in Idaho were also important for a time in its fur trade system. It had major salmon fisheries at Pillar Rock on the lower Columbia in Washington and at Willamette Falls at Oregon City in Oregon. The company maintained a large horse farm at Walla Walla in what is now Washington, and it had established the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, a wholly owned subsidiary at Cowlitz Prairie, to grow livestock and wheat and oats and timothy to feed the Russian American company in Alaska. So the company was widespread in its interests and investments. But there was an issue. Where was that primary channel in the San Juan Islands? Was it a red line that ran between Fidalgo and Orcas Lopez? Was it the green line that ran between San Juan and the other islands? Or was it that blue line that came down the Straits of Harrow close to the city of Victoria? The Hudson's Bay Company, 3 years after the Oregon Treaty, had established Bellevue Farm on San Juan Island. This was a new British outpost in the San Juans. It was substantial. It had several buildings, and the personnel for the Hudson's Bay Company raised pigs, sheep, and cattle to help feed the residents living at Fort Victoria on the southern end of Vancouver Island. Charles Griffin was the Hudson's Bay Company farmer at Bellevue Farm on San Juan Island. He became engaged in a spirited exchange of views and words with an American settler named Cutler. Cutler said, "That pig was eating my potatoes." And Griffin said, "Rubbish. It's up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." Well, here we go.
Now the pig, it was Canadian, the settler was a Yank. What the pig did to his garden was more than just a prank, for it dug up his potatoes and tore down his fence. Since it wasn't just the first time, Cutler's anger was immense.
So the pig had caused a controversy. The British pig had eaten up some American potatoes. So what would be the resolution? Maybe a payment. How about $100? How about no? How about calling in the police? But there weren't any local police. There was no county. How about bringing in the Army? Oh my goodness, that's exactly what happened. And the Navy, and that's what happened. Both the British ship, the Satellite, and the U.S. Coast Survey, the Active, were present on Puget Sound when this dispute arose, and the two naval vessels faced down each other. The United States and England moved to the brink of war in 1859. On June 15, Lyman Cutler, the American, had shot the pig. The British then threatened to evict Cutler and 18 other American settlers living on San Juan Island. William Harney, for whom Harney County is named, was the commander in the Department of the Columbia, stationed at Fort Vancouver. And on the 27th of July, he ordered Company D of the 9th Artillery U.S. Army from Fort Bellingham to occupy San Juan Island. By August 31, the confrontation was underway. 461 American soldiers with 14 cannon were on the island digging redoubts or fortifications, and 2,000 British soldiers and 5 ships with 167 cannons were there to face them down. Meanwhile, the messages were going east to the Buchanan administration, and of course, Buchanan did not know what in the world was going on in the Pacific Northwest.
The general came ashore, and he listened to their tale. He was a man of action, and to help he did not fail. To Fort Bellingham he sent, ere he sailed away again, and down came Captain Pickett with a company of men.
The American soldiers under Pickett, later killed at Gettysburg during the Civil War, soon occupied what they called American Camp. They moved in on the southern end of the island in 1859. Charles Pickett made a posting, had it printed, and put it up all over the San Juan Islands. This being United States territory, no laws other than those of the United States, nor courts, except such as are held by virtue of said laws, will be recognized or allowed on this island. Whoops. The winter of 1859 proved to be cold and bleak and tense in the San Juans. The Americans began building right over the top of the Hudson's Bay Company gardens and stockyards at Bellevue Farm. They established a large post with many buildings surrounded by a fence with major fortifications. The officers' quarters from that post built during the Civil War yet stand. It also included a blockhouse, barracks, and parade ground. In this photograph from the 19th century, we can see how substantial this investment actually was. And the troops were at work digging excavations to house the cannon and other large weaponry that the Americans brought into the island. Lieutenant Robert, who devised Robert's Rules of Order, was the engineer in charge of the fortifications. Today, we can yet see the substantial work that was done at American camp to outfit the army in case of a British invasion of the southern part of the island. Mount Finlayson is the southernmost tip of the island, and the Americans firmly occupied that part of San Juan. Meanwhile, on the northern end of the island, the British soldiers from Fort Victoria established English camp. They moved in on an old shell midden of a former Indian village and initially put up tents.
Then up sailed the British with warships 1, 2, and 3, which made a few too many for Pickett's company. They had to find a way to even up the score, so he sent to Fort Steilacoom and got 500 more.
So Pickett, faced with several British warships and troops at English camp, went to Fort Steilacoom at the southern end of Puget Sound and got 500 more Army personnel. Garrison Bay was the point of landing at the English camp on the northern end of San Juan Island. It was served or supplied by a side wheeler that also had sails. It was a substantial investment comparable to American camp on the southern end of the island. It housed dozens and dozens of troops. The conflict over a pig had escalated significantly into troop buildup and ship buildup in Puget Sound. The British also built a blockhouse, and the original yet stands. They constructed permanent barracks, and being Brits with a bit of free time, they built a formal garden, a really beautiful garden that has been created today on the shore at English camp on Garrison Bay. In fact, the British were there for so many years during this confrontation that they also established a post cemetery. So those who died while in service were buried at English camp. So here's the lay of the land. American camp down on the southern end of the island, English camp at the northern end, and naval vessels sailing back and forth through the Straits of Harrow and the San Juan Channel. There were real problems for Uncle Sam. Here, Uncle Sam says, "What will we do with them?" He is quite worried as he is portrayed in this cartoon. And if we look at them across the split rail fence, the British in Canada are busy harvesting, chopping wood, and plowing. Well, on the American side of the 49th parallel, there's a young man throwing rocks, breaking out a street lamp. There's a melee in the street. There's inebriated men drinking whiskey and two men tearing down the fence. In other words, there's a bit of chaos, particularly on the American side of the border. The tensions of the situation were constantly stirred up by William S. Harney, of the Military Department of Oregon with its headquarters at Fort Vancouver. The Lincoln administration could only engage in head shaking. There was no seeming end to this conflict. The tensions also were exacerbated by Governor James Douglas, the governor of British Columbia, based in Victoria. Governor Douglas ordered Robert Baines, a British admiral, to land the Marines and seize the American camp on San Juan Island. Baines observed, "Two great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig is utterly foolish." He declined to follow the dictates of the governor of British Columbia. In the meantime, the Lincoln administration sent Winfield Scott to the Pacific Northwest to try to resolve things. He was one of the most senior members of the U.S. Army, having served way back on the War of 1812 and enlisting in the Army in 1808. He had run for president in 1852. He came to British Columbia in 1859 and served as military advisor to Abraham Lincoln. But Scott was not able to resolve the conflict either. So what came out of it was a recommendation from Scott. "The highest obligation of my station compels me to suggest a doubt whether it be safe in respect to our foreign relations or to the gallant officers and men of the Oregon Department to leave them longer at so great a distance, subject to the ignorance, passion, and caprice of the present headquarters of that department," namely William Harney at Fort Vancouver. Scott was quite disappointed with other Army leaders. So what was going on San Juan Island, an English camp and American camp? Well, the soldiers were there starting in 1859, and they served all through the 1860s. They played cards. They found a local tavern and drank beer and other liquor. They engaged in competitions between the two camps, boxing, bare knuckle boxing, and horse races. And being in the San Juans, they dug a lot of clams and they trapped crabs. They enjoyed the resources of the San Juans. And the British persisted in gardening in their beautiful formal garden at English camp. Well, there were some really major issues that were unresolved, and these were in place by 1870. One of them was the question of fisheries along the Atlantic coast of Canada. There was the issue of the boundary through the San Juans. There was the access question of the Stickeen River into the Yukon in Alaska. And there were the Alabama claims that resulted from events during the Civil War. The Union had lost some 60 merchant ships because of the Confederate raider Alabama that the British had permitted to sail the high seas. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts demanded that Britain pay the United States $2 billion for the Alabama claims or cede Canada to the United States. William Seward, Secretary of State under Lincoln, demanded that at least British Columbia should be ceded to the United States. So the Atlantic fisheries issue off Nova Scotia, the status of the boundary in the San Juan Islands, access to the Yukon via the Stickeen River, which was a critical stream mostly located in British Columbia, but entering the Pacific Ocean between Petersburg and Wrangell, Alaska, and the Alabama sinking of 60 U.S. merchant and naval ships. These all became embroiled in the Pig War settlement.
When they argued in the Senate and in the House of Lords, and they didn't make much progress, but they used a lot of words, so they asked the German emperor the boundary to define and tell us treaty makers where to draw the line.
So there was an effort to try to make resolution, but also a lot of lively debate. Ultimately, the matter was put out to arbitration. The Treaty of Washington Commission, made up of British and American representatives, traveled to Europe, as well as meeting in the US to seek the resolution of the conflict. Article 35 of the Treaty of Washington, 1871, called upon His Majesty the Emperor of Germany to make a final and conclusive determination about the issues. Kaiser Wilhelm I was that arbitrator. There were commission meetings in 1872, and then he promulgated his decision.
Now, the Kaiser gave his answer in 1872 and said that Harrow Strait was where the line went through. Well, they called it a war, but it wasn't very big, and the only one got killed was a little British pig.
So the line that the Kaiser drew ran from the 49th parallel down through the islands following the Straits of Harrow, and it meant that about 80% of the San Juan Islands became the property of the United States. Britain retained the Gulf Islands just to the north of that boundary. There was also an agreement that the British would pay $15 million to the United States for the damages wrought by the Confederate raider Alabama. And that helped heal that wound. So the Little Pig War became a matter of helping expedite a settlement in international diplomacy by the intervention of Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. A number of authors have addressed this topic, and those of you who are interested in reading more about the details may want to turn to the Pig War, the most perfect war in history, or the Pig War, or the Pig War, standoff at Griffin Bay, or the Pig War. The authors are a bit troubled to find a different title, but these all are 4 readable books, most of them in print, about this event. Today, the San Juan Islands belong to the United States and they're part of the state of Washington. They are a place of permanent year-round homes for several thousand Washingtonians, and they're also a very popular recreational playground, especially in the summer, for the residents of the Pacific Northwest and Seattle to Bellingham in particular. American Camp is administered today by the National Park Service. It's part of San Juan Island National Historic Park. English Camp on the northern end of the island is also administered by the National Park Service, since all of San Juan Island was deemed to belong to the United States as of the decision of 1871, promulgated in 1872. If you go to San Juan Island, your most likely point of arrival is Friday Harbor. It's where the Washington ferry system comes in and out throughout the day. It's also possible to enter San Juan Island at Roach Harbor near Garrison Bay, but that entry is usually by private motorboat or sailing boat. It is where the U.S. Customs and Immigration Office are located on the northwestern end of the island near English Camp. San Juan Island has a fairly extensive road system. It has a town, a library, 2 National Park Service facilities, and a really stunning research facility, the Marine Laboratory of the University of Washington. On nearby Lopez Island, there's also a vineyard, but honestly, most of the wine that's produced at Lopez has been trucked in from east of the Cascade Mountains from the Columbia Plateau, though some table grapes do grow in the San Juans. So if you're out and about and want to have an encounter with a really beautiful landscape and a bit of American history, I recommend that you take in a visit to the San Juan Islands. I want to acknowledge in particular John Dwyer's The San Juan Pig, the poem published in 1978 that has been read as part of this presentation, several of the books, and also the alumni travel study program of Lewis and Clark College, for which I initially prepared this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Beckham. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I do have a question for you, though, Dr. Beckham. What got you so interested in this history? Like, how did you first hear about it?
Honestly, it began in 1965. I started writing my doctoral dissertation at UCLA, which was a biography of an ethnographer, cartographer, lawyer, who was the secretary for the Hudson's Bay Company Claims Commission, settling the disputes of the Hudson's Bay Company under the Oregon Treaty. His name was George Gibbs. And Gibbs came west in 1849 and stayed in the Pacific Northwest until 1861. He lived at Steilacoom at the southern end of Puget Sound, but traveled extensively in the San Juan Islands as secretary to the Western Washington Indian Treaty Commission. He eventually also became the geologist and ethnographer for the survey of the 49th parallel between 1857 and 1861. So George Gibbs was all through this area, particularly the Salish Sea or Puget Sound. And in my research on Gibbs, I began finding more and more stories and more interesting figures. I've also been involved for several years as the expert witness in a reservation boundary issue in the San Juans, and that has been another item that has fostered my interest.
We have one question. I was once told that English Camp is the only location in the United States that another nation's flag is allowed to fly by itself on any federally controlled property. Can you confirm this?
I believe that is correct. The National Park Service permits the Union Jack to fly at English Camp on Garrison Bay on the northern end of San Juan Island. It's quite interesting because it's a National Park Service enclave, but the British flag does fly there.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this unique history and a nice way to end a war pretty neatly.
I have a closing comment. One of my favorite books was written by an author who lived in Bend, Oregon 110 years ago. His name was George Palmer Putnam, and he was heir to the G.P. Putnam publishing fortune in New York City. Mr. Putnam was the founder of the Bend Bulletin, the newspaper that Robert Chandler edited and published for so many years in the 20th century. G.P. Putnam, during his time at Bend, wrote a volume called In the Oregon Country, which is a really poignant account of homesteading on the high desert, of the people who came with high expectations and ended up in places like Milliken or the Fort Rock Valley, who tried to make a go of farming in a very arid landscape. Mr. Putnam is also interesting because he was not only the editor and founder of the Bend Bulletin, he served as secretary to Governor Whitcomb in Salem, and his wife, Dorothy Binney, was heir to the Crayola fortune. So for those of you who want, and then his second wife was Amelia Earhart, whom some of you may have heard about. So there are some interesting people who've sojourned at least for a time in the Upper Deschutes country, and G.P. Putnam is one of those that's high on my list of fascinating personalities.
Thank you, Dr. Beckham. That is fun to hear, a fun little tidbit about Bend history, the Bend Bulletin, Amelia Earhart, and Crayola. There's just a lot there.
That's kind of my approach to history. I'm very interested in the human side of the historical experience.
Well, and that's evident. That's great. Well, thank you very much for sharing this with us. And for those of you who decided to spend your evening with us, thank you so much. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.